straight to the core, an in-depth, no-nonsense look into all things physical therapy, wellness, and the business of being healthy. We are your hosts. I'm Claire.
I'm Mark.
And today, Mark, what's our topic today?
Our topic is going to be what we think is the best athlete sport, as in what sport has the best all-around athlete. This is going to be fairly controversial, I think. It shouldn't be. We're going to be as objective as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things that go into that, and probably every single athlete probably thinks that their sport is like the best, right?
Probably.
From an enjoyment standpoint, but we're talking more so like what sport do we think is producing the best athletes?
Yeah, and we're going to have to define athleticism. So I'll try to do a definition of athleticism, and then I'll let you do the same.
Well, I think probably first off, we talk about sport, right? And for this topic of conversation, like we're talking about all sports. I know sometimes we'll get into the topic in the clinic where we talk about like, well, the subjective versus the objective aspects of sports. And the one that always comes to mind is gymnastics. Is that obviously they're fantastic athletes, but there's a subjective scoring when it comes to gymnastics. But for this conversation, all intents and purposes, we're talking about all sports.
We're going to talk about all sports that have a set of rules that involves some athletic ability. So games will be excluded from this, and what you decide is a game versus a sport is probably another podcast. But
no esports.
I would not call esport an so it's a brain game. Chess is not a sport either.
I think they probably take themselves out of this conversation anyway, in terms of athleticism.
Well, they'd be watching this on YouTube because they watch people play video games on YouTube all day. Ask me how I know. Okay, so do we want to define athleticism?
Go for it.
Okay, so to me, athleticism is the combination of balance, proprioception, strength, ability to, obviously there's some skill involved in your sport generally, speed, endurance, everything.
What's proprioception, Mark? That's a big word.
Proprioception is your body's ability to feel where it is in space.
Oh, okay.
It's the communication
Body
between
awareness.
your brain and your feet and your body and the awareness of such. It's a component of balance, but balance is not just... Proprioceptive awareness is a bit more complicated than just pure balance.
Being able to control your body, know how you need to control your body, things like that. Controlling body position, being able to move from, position to position as needed.
Instinctually, generally.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well...
All right. Do you want my pick, I guess?
I think I probably know what it is, but start us off.
This is hard because I feel like the top two are very, very close. And off the bat, I'm going to exclude the decathlon or the decathlete because that is technically one sport, but it's 10 different events.
And heptathlon and
I think those make the best. I think probably the best overall athlete in the world is a decathlete, but that's literally 10 sports that they're good at all of them.
Well, and I think probably we're putting a lot of specifics out here, but yeah. I personally am going to not include CrossFit in this group because CrossFit is a conglomeration of each of these individual sports, right? Like there's
gymnastics,
weightlifting, there's gymnastics, there's running, there's swimming, there's triathlon in any given CrossFit competition. So just for this, I think we can all agree that some of the best athletes in the world end up in CrossFit, but they don't necessarily, we're not talking about them today.
Okay. All right. So I think, these are going to be together because they're similar, and I have some experience playing one of them. The other one I don't, but to me, they're similar from an athletic point of view. I'm going to put the top two as together.
Okay, yeah, I'm on the edge of my seat. I'm on pins and needles.
Well, and these are not like my favorite sports, but from a purely objective athletic point of view, I think soccer and rugby are number one. And I put them together because they're very similar in how they're played. One involves much more contact, but you have a balance of skills involved, footwork, balance, interval sprinting and cutting, high velocity, low velocity, ball handling skills, and then, of course, endurance.
I would agree with that. I probably would give the slight edge to rugby, only because I think some of...
Because there's a scrum.
Who doesn't love to say scrum?
Scrum. So you're basically taking soccer and adding a scrum to it with heavy contact, which involves more strength.
Yes, that's what I was going to say.
You're
Is that
taking the strength into it.
we work with a lot of soccer athletes, and they are some of the most amazing, resilient athletes that I've seen. Right, their ability to do all the things, right? Like reaction and agility and acceleration, deceleration, but then the skill of being able to handle, the ball.
Handling.
But the one thing that I do feel like is great for our business, but bad for soccer players is maybe a lack of strength, which I think is where rugby maybe gets the slight edge.
I wouldn't give it I would give it a huge edge. Have you seen male rugby players? They're gigantic.
Yes, I have.
Yeah, they're apparently
I've
very good looking.
studied them extensively.
It's like a hybrid of, a football player, an American football player, and a soccer player. They're smaller than our football players, but some of them are pretty big, and they're very athletic.
Yes.
Very.
Well, I mean, you look at American football, right? And you have some stellar athletes out there, the quarterbacks and wide receivers and tight ends, but then you also have like defensive linemen.
Well, some defensive linemen are like fantastic athletes. D end.
Okay, yes, and some are not.
Well, it just depends on what you define as like super athletic. But as an all-around athlete, your football players, your wide receivers, your cornerbacks, your linebackers, and your running backs are the pure athletes, in my opinion.
Yeah, but I feel like rugby compared to American football, like you do have some people on the field in American football that maybe their deficits don't matter. They're athletic deficits that an offensive or a defensive lineman, they lack in cardio compared to maybe their rugby counterparts, but it's not that big of a deal because of the very specific position that they play.
Correct. And obviously there's built-in intervals in American football, which rugby has a very different ongoing clock that is constant. Right. And the field is large. It's constantly moving.
Yes.
And there's not a lot of pads.
No. But there is a scrum.
There is a scrum, which is extremely interesting to watch.
I enjoy a rugby toss too. I would think from a shoulder perspective, it's
I will say though, from a skill point of view, it probably doesn't have quite the skill involved in soccer because
I
there's
would
not
give
the
soccer
ball
the
handling.
edge on that one for sure.
Yes, the ball handling, the juggling of the feet. That is all very skilled. This is more like rugby would be the counterpart that's heavily biased towards just pure athleticism.
Yes.
So if I had to choose between the two, because of the scrum and the heavy contact, I'm going to have to give rugby the slight edge to soccer. But soccer is very, not an honorable mention. Like that is like number 2 by like this much.
Yeah. No, some of the soccer athletes that we have that come through the clinic are amazing athletes. And like I said, the resilience to be able to have an injury, play through it very often, or come back and, coming off of a horrific injury, then I think some of those athletes, like they're some of the mentally toughest athletes that I think we deal with as well. So it's hard to put them in second place, but I would give rugby the slight edge there.
I would do the same. Okay, so I'm going to go right into number 2.
Okay.
Number 2 for me is gymnastics because it involves strength, power,
skill,
tons of skill. You have multiple events which are not really that related to each other. Strength, skill, explosiveness, proprioception out of this world, flexibility out of this world. I will say mental toughness is probably got to be one of the highest of all sports because of the amount of events and amount of practice that is required for that sport.
I mean, you're trending towards something like a decathlete in terms of like the all-around gymnastics. Yeah. So, watching the Olympics, the all-around champion isn't necessarily the person that wins the individual events because very often it's not. But being able to do all of those things. I mean, obviously, I have a tremendous amount of respect for Simone Biles, even more so now that like she old. Right? Like she's
for a female gymnast, she is essentially geriatric. So if she comes back and medals, that is one of the best stories of all of sports.
Yes.
She's literally 10 years older than almost everybody that she's competing against.
We often talk about how gymnasts have to be younger because that decision-making part of their brain hasn't quite developed, in the sense of like, hey, you know how you're flying through the air at a great rate of speed, and why don't we add in a twist to that? And you get a 14-year-old like, okay.
And a blind landing.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. That sounds really cool.
I'll do that.
Whereas, my 42-year-old brain instantly is like, absolutely not. What,
Yeah, you imagine what can happen
Exactly.
if you land incorrectly. So, yeah, I think that if she can medal in the Olympics here in 2 weeks, one of the most interesting stories of sports of all time. Comeback story.
I would agree.
Yeah.
I think also the strength, the power production that male gymnasts, I mean, if you ever watched the rings,
and they're
right?
and they're older.
Yes. I mean, the shoulder strength and stability, like you have to have just an amazing amount of body awareness and yes, like raw strength and power, but stability. So if you've ever done like a plank, right? Planks suck, but a dynamic plank where you're moving in and out of a position and stopping and controlling that movement is infinitely harder. And now take that same idea and you're applying it to like movable rings. I think any CrossFit athlete can agree to that. Is a muscle up on a bar is one thing. A muscle up on a unpredictable apparatus like a set of rings.
Well, I mean, that transitions right into the Iron Cross, which is probably arguably the hardest thing in all sports to achieve. Like most athletes do not have, in any sport, do not have the strength to weight ratio to be able to hold an Iron Cross and make it look good. That's just, and you say it probably doesn't matter in real life. It probably doesn't, but it's still an act of strength and athleticism that I don't think that there's probably, I doubt there's any pro football player that can do it.
Oh,
I think they're way too big.
Well, there's obviously the skill involved, but yes,
but just the strength
that
alone.
balance between being strong enough to be able to do it, but then you have to have that strength in a relatively like compact little body.
Yeah, it has to be that strength to weight ratio. Body. Oh, geez, this is where that's going. Okay, so that's my number 2.
Okay,
gymnastics. Fantastic athletes, all around good athletes. Many different sports involved in there. The amount of practice and discipline from a young age. You can't just take up gymnastics and get good with it. We hear stories sometimes of, somebody comes from a different country or whatever, and they started playing American football when they're like a junior in high school, and they're good and they're playing college Division I. That's not going to happen in gymnastics.
No.
You have to do your entire life gymnastics 5 hours a day, basically every day.
Now, the one thing that
decades.
I will say that maybe we see in the clinic in terms that what maybe gymnasts are lacking is sometimes some of that like reactionary speed, that sort of thing, when it comes to actually like agility. So planned agility, they're amazing at, right?
Well, yeah, because they're rehearsed.
Right. But I mean, some of like we use blaze pods in the clinic for agility, lateral movement, side to side, acceleration, deceleration. Sometimes that's lacking.
Yeah, their balance is fantastic.
Right. So compared to, like a soccer player where there is just that element of unpredictability that's built into their sport, then I would definitely say that that's probably something that maybe gymnastics just as a sport is lacking.
I never really thought of it that way, but it's totally true.
Thank you.
Gymnastics is a sport of rehearsal. Mm-hmm. Nothing changes. It's not like the position of the vault changes as you're running towards it. It's not moving.
Now, I will say that I think if you asked any
it's very static.
Like seasoned gymnast, that they would say there's times where they have to make a split-second decision of, like vault in particular. Hey, you hit the springboard, you hit the vault, and something's not happening, and you're like, nope, this is going to be a double.
It,
yeah,
yes.
and that's mad props to them for being able to do
Absolutely.
that. But that goes back to kind of body awareness, proprioception, kinesthetic awareness, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so they have the fear, obviously of being injured and danger and whatever. But you're right; it's a rehearsed routine. Mm-hmm. And so there's not a lot of dynamic decision making on the fly.
Yes, I make excellent points.
That's an excellent point.
I've
never thought of it that way.
Thank you.
It's a very static sport that doesn't change.
Now, I am biased as my own background, but I'm going to throw maybe a potential third out there.
Well, I have my own third.
I'm sure you do, but
you probably won't guess what it is.
Well, probably not. I was going to say that at least an honorable mention, because it is the hardest thing that I have ever done in my entire life, and that would be rowing. Now, there's two types of rowing, and if you listen to our first podcast, then you might remember that I was on the rowing team at Creighton when I was in college. And that is something called sweep rowing. You have one oar per person, and that is just like raw power, strength. You are on this seat, your feet are buckled in, and you are just like pulling and pushing this thing as hard as you can. There is something else called sculling. And this is where my honorable mention goes in, is specifically sculling, because you have two oars. You have one oar in each hand. And so there has to be this balance between power production and raw strength, but also like this finite balance and this control of movement and this like, it just has to be very like delicate, but then raw and powerful at the same time. So from a cardio and strength aspect, balance and body perception, spot on.
The
Obviously,
problem
we're
is,
sitting.
the problem is you're not actually doing anything realistic. Like you're sitting down and you're rowing.
Have you ever canoed?
Yeah, not often. Not super often. It's probably fun. I did it when I was a kid, but
I just had to get it in. I just had to like
the strength and agility and the reaction time that would be lacking. That can be. Is that number 3 for you, or is that an honorable mention?
Well, I didn't really have a list. I just let you talk. I'm just agreeing or disagreeing with what you're saying.
Normally disagreeing. All right.
But no, I guess that's. But I'm just throwing it out there that, hey, even if they don't make the list, like these are some stellar athletes. I played a lot of sports growing up. Like I've played a lot of different sports, and to this day, sculling specifically is probably the hardest thing that I have ever done.
Well, I will say that when I've been on a rower in a 2,000 meter competition, and I was really trying to get a good time, and I trained for this, that is the most tired I've ever been. So without a doubt, I was like dead.
Like VO2 max wise, cardio wise.
From pure like anaerobic explosion that turns into kind of an aerobic, because that's like a 7-8 minute thing for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. The amount of energy expended at a small amount of time is incredible.
Yes.
And I have never been more tired than when I've done an all out.
And then imagine that with some skill involved as well.
Yeah, I absolutely think it is right up there.
All right, what's your number 3, since I won't guess it?
I don't think you'll guess it.
You probably know what my pick would be. Rowing.
What do you think mine is?
Well, I would have said something along the lines of like motocross, BMX, that sort of thing, because we had this conversation in the clinic earlier this week.
This is hard because I've got 2 of them. So I'm going to do one.
Yeah, so you have a 3 and a 4.
Well, I have a 3 with an honorable mention.
Tell us, Mark.
I am going to pick wrestling.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's strength, it's skill, it's endurance, it's
agility.
Mental. Yeah, it's a mental game. It's everything. They're going to be powerful, strong, flexible, intelligent, the good ones, and mentally very tough. Plus, the skill is incredible, and the chess game is incredible.
Well, there's physical skill, and then there's mental skill involved with it, right? Like it's constant decision making on the fly. You have to be athletic enough to be able to.
It's fast.
Yeah, to put to action the thoughts of what are happening in very real time.
And I would put the skill set similar to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's very similar. There's less emphasis on takedowns and the positions are different, but the skill set is very similar.
Yes.
So I'm gonna put them in the same category.
Your attack can kind of come from anything, right? Like it's very much chess, like you said. Like you could be focused on doing one thing, and then all of a sudden you realize that like the one thing that you're trying to do is leaving you vulnerable to your opponent doing something.
Yeah,
right?
many steps ahead of you.
Right.
Yes, I think that it's not a great spectator sport for most people unless you understand what's happening and you're seasoned in that sport. It will never be a great spectator sport for a regular person because they just will not understand unless they are a grappler of some sort. So
well, and I don't think that you can overstate the mental toughness. Like that's yes, there's the weight control, which that's an entirely different topic, and we can talk about that. But my dad actually wrestled in college. Scrawny Ronnie.
What weight class was he in?
It was like
70 kilos, 60 kilos.
I don't think he was a 125, or maybe like what is the next one, like 132? Is that he was Scrawny Ronnie? I mean, he's a slight man.
Yes.
I had to send him the link for our last podcast anyway, so it's not like he's listening. But
we do have good listeners, though. Actually,
We do.
We've now surpassed 250 downloads. That's
don't we have a round of applause there
we do somewhere.
somewhere? It's gonna be like, but
Yay! I wish it faded out. It was too abrupt. But okay, so do you have an honorable mention, or do you not agree?
oh
with this
no,
one?
I was talking about wrestling.
Ronnie,
Yeah,
okay.
Scrawny Ronnie. That growing up, like I have an older sister, and she's very much like a girl's girl, and so my dad was like, well, all right, you're as close to a son. Long story short is my dad used to wrestle, and then he was a wrestling coach for a very brief period of time when I was growing up. And he used to take his forearm and he would press it up against my forehead.
That sounds like abuse.
I'm sure I deserved it, but that hurts. Sorry. Like wrestling around, like roughhousing. That's all stuff that.
So your father was bullying like a 70-pound female.
Yes.
Good job,
Yes,
Ron.
and it made me tougher for that. But
It did.
The whole point of that story is not to call CPS, but
It's too late.
is to talk about like the mental toughness, right? Like you're focused on a goal. Can you imagine if like in the 100-meter dash, then as you're like halfway through the race and someone throws like a 2x4 at you and you have to like like that's
I think that would make it a lot more interesting.
it would make it a great spectator.
There's like an
sport.
obstacle course.
But, like just that element of like mental toughness that you have to overcome for something like that. I give wrestlers a huge amount of respect. Wrestlers sometimes are kind of weird.
Well, they are weird, but you know what? They're easy to rehab because they don't ask a lot of questions and they're used to really hard practices that most people probably couldn't tolerate. And so they just kind of do what you tell them to do and they don't really complain because all you have to do is be like, that's not as hard as practice. And they're like, yep, that's true.
Yeah. And pain is part of the expectation, I guess, for their sport.
You have to be very, very comfortable with being uncomfortable, much just like a gymnast. Gymnasts are always injured in
Yes.
some way.
Yes.
Tendonitis, they're injured, they're sore, like whatever. They're always beat up. Always.
Yeah.
Always.
Now, this is an entirely different topic, but a lot of success in life can probably be looked back at your success and how you obviously deal with things like injuries and your ability to work as teammates and things like that. But I think some of these like hardcore sports that we're talking about that produce these fantastic athletes, they're also producing like fantastic humans. Right? Like to have that aspect of, oh, this is hard, but I've done harder things. Or
it's going to get uncomfortable, but I can push through it.
Right.
And do it again.
Right.
And then do it better.
Yeah.
That's good.
So do you have an honorable mention?
I do.
Yeah.
I want to make sure that I clear this up, though. My third one in said wrestling, jiu-jitsu. The MMA athlete, I think, is a hybrid athlete, which is also a fantastic athlete, but I'm going to call that a hybrid sport with many multiple sports combined, just like the decathlon, so I'm not counting it. My honorable mention, do you know what it is?
I don't know. I mean.
You don't. It's tennis.
Oh, very timely. Wimbledon is going on.
So tennis involves a lot of agility. Constant agility. Reaction time has to be off the chart. Skill set has to be off the chart. And especially with the men, they are moving at a high rate of speed for hours because of the sets involved. 5 sets. It's hours and hours and hours.
Yeah, the speed at which like elite tennis players, males,
It's 135
yes,
miles per
serving
hour.
at 130 miles an hour. Not only are you supposed to get your racket on that ball in a response to it, but you're supposed to make it back over the net in some way or fashion that makes the person who just served
not just
like,
destroy it back,
right.
which often they do. But 5 sets can go on for many hours, and there's endurance, there's reaction time, there is a ton of agility, short-term burst agility, jumping, running, sprinting, cutting, constant, different surfaces depending on where you're playing at.
Well, and I think there is an analytical part of tennis as well, that if you're playing on like Wimbledon, like I said, grass, I don't play tennis, but I have heard.
We tried once. She's
Uh,
not great at racket sports.
No, I can play racquetball. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway. The ball bounces differently on grass, right? And so you have to react to that. And based off of the grass, is it dry? Ooh, is the ball going to bounce on like this worn spot where
it's like golf.
Right.
The greens run
but
differently.
Then clay, you have to have that expectation that I'm going to slide. And so being able to adjust that, to be able to say like, gosh, you know what? Like this is how it's going to play today, or it rained yesterday, or there is, like in Wimbledon center court, like the roof is open. So there's more moisture. And so I have to be able to react to how the ball is bounced. I think that's tremendous respect there.
There's a lot going on. And if you're like a poor person you're playing on concrete all the time. And that's very different too. So
now I don't know the strength aspect of tennis players, obviously like shoulder, overhead strength, stability, things like that for serving.
Imagine how many times they swing that racket in a match, a 5-set match. It's a lot.
It is.
And they're hitting hard.
Yeah. Now I don't know if I was going to have like my friends help me move. I don't know if I would necessarily be like, yo, tennis players, come and help me like move this armoire.
No, probably not, but I think they're a very underrated. I think that's the most underrated athleticism sport out there.
Honorable mention. Nice.
Unless we're talking about some obscure sport that we don't talk about a whole lot.
Yes, for the 12 people who are probably listening, I'm sure
it's
they're
like
sitting,
25.
Okay, well, for the 25 people who are listening, they're probably like, what about this sport? Yeah, I know.
We're trying to stay very mainstream. We're trying to talk mainstream sports only.
Yeah. Now, I think that the caveat with this entire conversation is there are amazing athletes in every sport that have just chosen to play one sport. And I think we talked about a couple of podcasts ago about like multi-sport athletes and having these kids go through high school where they're playing 3-4 different sports, and then all of a sudden they have to specialize. So you might have a fantastic running back in the NFL who maybe had to make a decision at a young age. Am I going to go for track and field, or am I going to play for football? Well, there's money in football. There's not really money in track and field. And so I think that is an unfortunate reality sometimes of specialization in sports. And we talk about that all the time, is the death of generalization is specification.
Yeah. I mean, I work with a lot of strength athletes, and sometimes I'll get a comment as, why are the Russians so much stronger than Americans in strength sports? And I would say, because
the state-run steroid program probably didn't help.
I don't think that's just exclusive to one country, but that's their most important sports. Combat sports and strength sports. They don't have football. They don't really play other sports. They do hockey, of course, and they're good at that. But I think that that's a big part of it, is that's what's popular there. Our best athletes probably go to football because that's where the money is.
Yeah. And the fame and the celebrity. Now, we talk about this all the time at the clinic, and if you have been in the clinic, then you probably know this about Mark and Claire, is that we're Formula One fans.
Correct. Big time.
Yes.
All my Max Verstappen trophies over here in the background. He's multiple-time world champion. Yes. He's a cat guy.
Which probably makes you like him even more. And the only reason I bring this up is to follow up on my previous comment about like BMX, motocross, things like that. Sports from maybe that are lacking a little more of like the strength, skill, that sort of thing. Obviously there's skill in all of those sports, but just as an also ran, the cardiovascular ability, or the VO2 max of some of these athletes that you wouldn't think, like they're sitting, right? Well, they're laying. Formula One drivers are. They're
laying down on their backs, basically.
Laying down, or like a motocross where you're sitting on a bike. The cardio demands of these athletes are like out of this world, and the neck strength of these athletes and the core strength of these athletes is super, super impressive.
Yeah, I mean, you can argue if car racing is a sport or not. That's fine. I can argue that too. But the physical demands, especially on a Formula One driver, are so high, 4 to 6 G-forces lateral through an hour-long race, and we're talking about darting back and forth. That's more than any other roller coaster. So go on your worst roller coaster that you've ever been on, hang out there for an hour and a half with the fear of dying with this car that you're controlling.
Well, and
it's hot. There's fire that can happen. There's explosions and crashes.
I just read that it takes close to 200 pounds of force to fully engage the brake. So, you're
Incredible.
Going down a straight, going 200 some miles an hour, and something happens and you have to slam on the brake. Then, I mean, these are some serious athletes.
And that is a 6.5 G brake. So if you're a 200-pound male, what do you think that makes you feel like?
Yeah. Well, I don't think none of the Formula One
Okay,
drivers are
so
200
what's
pounds,
150
Yeah.
pounds times 6? It's a lot of
Exactly.
force on your body. And
Yeah.
I think most people just have no idea, including me. I've never felt that
And
before.
the reaction time I forget what the actual statistic is, but the reaction time, yeah.
They're mentally and physically very strong, but we don't think they're probably good athletes on a field, but some of them were athletes before.
Now the Formula One driver that all of us hate, all of us in this room hate, Lewis Hamilton. He's like, what? He's 40?
He'll be 40 this
Yeah,
year.
I'm going to give him props actually for being out there. And Alonso.
Fernando Alonso
Yeah.
is 42 years old. He's close to he's basically our age.
Yes.
To be able to compete with the reaction time, obviously reaction time probably slows around 30, but definitely at 35, 40, it is not the same as a 25-year-old. That's
Yeah.
why video game guys are like 18 or they're
Yeah.
16, because that's where your reaction time is the best.
So solid honorable mention there.
Yeah.
On my part.
All right. I think we can wrap this up. then.
My list is complete.
Well, I'm sure somebody's upset that I didn't put basketball in there, and I think basketball is heavily skilled, unfortunately. Like baseball. It's so heavily
Very-
skilled,
yes.
the athleticism component is not the primary. Skill is the primary.
Yeah. No, I would agree. In general, I agree with your list.
All right. In general, thank you.
In general.
Appreciate
Well,
that.
as always, so check us out on our website, CoreOmaha.com. Check us out on Instagram and Facebook, Core Omaha, and YouTube,
Yeah.
Core Physical Therapy and Sports Performance.
Yeah. Thank you for watching.
Yes, as always.